Before we begin, Galactic Horrors is now on Patreon. Get daily stories in one place, with no ads and no interruptions. Link is in the description or search Galactic Horrors on Patreon. Now, let's begin the transmission. The drill bit caught seam rock and kicked left, and I let the housing ride with it instead of fighting. 3 years in the deep shafts of Orcus teaches your wrists what your brain resists. The asteroid wins every argument you bring through force. You survive by reading where the stone wants to split and helping it along. I backed the bit out, swept powdered rock from the cut face, and checked the depth gauge. 612 meters below the main cell block. Deeper than any crew had drilled that quarter. Deeper than any work detail had gone since I'd arrived, at least by the shift rosters Perry liked to memorize. Sloan. The voice belonged to Boyd, the corrections officer assigned to our 5-man detail. He stood 10 meters behind the cutting face, sidearm on his hip, helmet lamp carving a white cone across the tunnel floor. Boyd was the closest thing to a decent guard on the asteroid. He didn't crack inmates for amusement, didn't short the tool vouchers, and ran drill schedules close enough to regulation that nobody lost fingers from exhaustion. On Orcus, that qualified as mercy. "Stay on the survey line," he said. "You're drifting left," I corrected. The survey line was a projected bore path on my helmet display, drawn by somebody in the Warden's operations office who had never stood in a tunnel. But you followed the line because the line was the sentence, and the sentence was why 5 men were cutting rock inside a captured asteroid for Sideron, a mineral consortium that processed our output and shipped it to foundries across 3 systems. My sentence was 20 years. I was in year 3. Back on Bridger Colony, I'd been a dock worker and union representative for the shipping hub local. I'd organised 2 successful labour actions and pushed for a third, a full dock strike over safety conditions that had already killed 6 men that year. The colonial administration contracted Sideron Security to break the picket. 14 workers died on the line. The security contractors were never charged. I was convicted of sedition and incitement and shipped to Orcus within the month. At intake, they put a stack of forms in front of me and called signing procedural, work assignment, medical clearance, disciplinary acknowledgement, a clause about supplementary biological sampling buried under correctional health language. I signed where they pointed because the cuffs were still on my wrists, and refusal would have changed only how hard they handled me afterward. Behind me, the rest of the detail worked their assigned sections. Kemp and Munn on the lateral bores, Jeffries running the rubble conveyor, and Perry, 23 years old, 8 months into a 5-year sentence for data theft, carrying the soft hands of a man who'd never done physical labour before this place, was supposed to be shoveling cuttings into the conveyor hopper. Every time I looked back, he was watching me, measuring me. His eyes moved from my drill line to the tunnel supports, to the conduit runs overhead, and his fingers twitched against his thigh as if he were drawing the route in the air. "Eyes on the work, Perry." He flinched and went back to shoveling. The kid had attached himself to me during his first week, the way younger inmates sometimes do when they identify someone whose reputation suggests protection. Perry had once told me he started memorizing floor plans because numbers settled him. He could hold whole diagrams in his head and walk them in silence when the cell lights went out. I told him that knowing the shape of a cage didn't make it less of a cage. He kept memorizing anyway. My reputation was specific and useless. The union man from Bridger, the labour organiser who'd called a strike that got 14 men killed. None of that protected Perry on Orcus, and I'd stopped explaining. Keeping my head down, working my shifts, and refusing every connection that might cost me something. That was how I'd made it to year 3. The gravity was wrong this far down. Localized generators carved into the rock at 50-meter intervals kept the tunnels oriented, but the lower-level units were ancient, decades past their service rating. Every few minutes the field would stutter, a quarter-second of weightlessness lifting your boots clear of the floor before the pull caught and drove you back down hard enough to sting your knees. Tools had to be tethered. Rubble drifted if you didn't bag it fast enough. The bore monitor chimed. Survey terminus. I killed the drill and stepped back from the face. The rock had changed. The iron silicate composite we'd been cutting through for weeks, grey and dense, had shifted to something lighter, almost white, with a crystalline grain that caught my helmet lamp and threw it back in fractured spikes. But the texture at the drill point stopped me. The bit had punched through the last 3 centimetres without resistance, as if the rock had opened onto empty space behind it. Boyd, I think we've breached into a cavity. Boyd came forward and pressed his own lamp to the bore hole. A thin current of cold moved through the opening, touching my exposed forearm where the suit sleeve had ridden up. It was colder than the tunnel air by a margin I could feel instantly. His face went still. Pull back, Boyd said. He unholstered his sidearm, which told me everything about how routine this wasn't. In 3 years of deep shifts, I'd never seen a guard draw on a rock wall. He radioed in. I caught fragments through the static. Breach at 612. Sealed stratum. Off survey line. Then the warden's voice came back, tinny and compressed through Boyd's earpiece, too quiet for me to pass. Boyd's expression changed. Whatever Warden Coyle told him drained something from behind his eyes. He holstered the sidearm and pointed at me. Widen the hole, Sloan, just you. Everyone else holds position. I widened the bore with a hand pick until the opening was large enough to press my helmet through. My lamp cut into the space beyond, and what it found made no immediate sense. The cavity was natural, roughly spherical, maybe 8 meters across, carved by some geological process long before Siderons started drilling. Pale, fibrous material coated the walls, floor, and ceiling, dense enough to obscure the rock beneath. Branching structures spread across every surface like root systems frozen mid-reach. In places they had lifted away from the stone and formed raised channels, thick as a man's wrist, all converging toward the center of the chamber floor. At the center lay 3 bodies. Human. Partially buried in the growth, which had climbed their legs and torsos and threaded itself through their clothing. Their exposed skin was hard, ridged with structures that resembled bone but couldn't be bone, because bone doesn't erupt through a living man's forearm in jagged white plates. Their faces were distorted, cheekbones sharpened to blades. Orbital ridges thickened until their eyes were almost hidden behind shelves of new tissue. I recognized one of them. Vasquez, from D-Block. He'd been assigned to a deep detail 2 months ago. The shift report said his entire crew had died in a tunnel collapse. I'd eaten opposite Vasquez in the mess hall for 6 months. He'd had a gap between his front teeth and a tattoo of a compass rose on his neck. The tattoo was gone. A plate of white bone had grown up from his collarbone and spread across his throat, consuming the ink under an inch of hard new tissue. But the gap in his teeth was still visible because his mouth was open, his jaw working slowly, the muscles in his face contracting around structures that hadn't been part of him 2 months ago. He was alive. I pulled back from the hole. Boyd was watching me with the expression of a man who already knew what we'd found. You knew about this, I said. Step back from the bore, Sloan. Vasquez is in there. His crew wasn't killed in a collapse. They're growing into the walls. Boyd's hand went to his sidearm again. His eyes moved to the rest of the detail. Perry, Kemp, Munn, Jeffries, all watching from their stations, too far to have seen what I'd seen, but close enough to sense the tension. I'm going to say this once. Boyd spoke low, close, pitched only for me. The Warden runs a program. Deep-level exposure details. Biological research for Sideron. I don't manage it. I don't choose who goes down. I escort the crews and bring back whoever comes back. Whoever comes back. His mouth tightened. You've been feeding men to whatever that is. I've been keeping my post and keeping my head down, which is exactly what you're going to do if you're as smart as your file says. He keyed his radio. Details complete. Returning to upper level. The ascent took 40 minutes. Gravity improved as we climbed. The upper-level generators were newer, better maintained, and the pull steadied from the deep shaft's stuttering unreliability to something close to standard. Nobody spoke. Perry kept glancing at me with the expression of someone who knows something happened and fears the answer. I waited until we were in the transit corridor 2 levels below the cell block, the rest of the crew ahead and out of earshot, before I put my hand on Boyd's shoulder. "Don't touch me, Sloan. How long has this been running? I told you what I know. You told me enough to confirm that the Warden is sending inmates into those tunnels as raw material for whatever is growing down there. How long?" Boyd stopped walking. The corridor was empty. Grey rock walls, strip lighting, a conduit overhead carrying atmosphere from the processors above. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had carried a specific weight for a long time and arranged his entire life around the decision to never examine it. "Longer than you've been here," he said. The old chambers were sealed. 612 was supposed to stay closed from this side. Then why were we cutting into it? He looked away. "Coyle moved the survey line last week. That breach changes something, doesn't it? Fresh air changes it. Open structure changes it. The thing roots slow in stale rock and sealed chambers. Give it circulation, vibration, heat, bodies moving past it. It wakes up wrong. I've seen men root in place after controlled exposure. I've seen others stay mobile for hours if the dose is wrong or the containment breaks. That's all I'm giving you. Forget the cavity, forget Vasquez, do your shifts. Stay above level 400 and stop asking questions that don't have answers you can survive knowing." Boyd walked on. I let him go. The PA system woke D-Block hard enough to drive men out of sleep before they understood the words. "Attention all inmates. Emergency shift rotation effective immediately. All work-capable prisoners report to Staging Area 4 for deep-level deployment. Non-compliance will result in solitary confinement. This is not a drill." I sat up on my bunk. Around me, men moved in the red wash of night cycle lighting, confused, angry, pulling on boots and swearing. Emergency rotations happened once or twice a year, usually after a production shortfall. This was different. The call was for every work-capable prisoner, and the deployment was deep level. The Warden was sending the entire available population down toward the shafts where I'd found Vasquez fused into the walls hours earlier. Coyle knew my crew had breached the cavity. He knew what I'd seen. If the chamber had been sealed until we opened it, he had one narrow window to take what he wanted before the breach became a disaster no incident report could bury. Bodies for samples. Bodies for containment. Bodies to overwhelm the lower levels with enough exposure data that Sideron could salvage value from a failure. Or he had already lost control of something he thought he could manage, and this was damage containment dressed as a work order. Either way, I was staying clear of Staging Area 4. I dressed, left the cell, and went looking for Boyd. I found him in the guard station on level 2, a cramped room with a security desk, weapon lockers, and a bank of monitors showing corridor feeds from across the facility. Boyd was alone. He wasn't at the desk. He was pulling equipment from a locker. A rebreather unit, a sealed ration pack, an emergency beacon, evacuation gear. "You're running," I said. He spun. His hand went to his hip before he placed my face. "Sloan, you need to be at Staging 4. So you can funnel me into the deep levels with the rest of them. I've seen what's down there, Boyd. I saw the cavity." "Then you know why I'm packing a bag." He shoved the rebreather into a duffel. His movements were fast, clumsy, stripped of the professional composure I'd associated with him across 3 years of shift escorts. "The Warden pushed the timetable after your breach. The whole lower section has gone hot. The growth is spreading past the old test chambers and into the vented rock. I've been watching the feeds for weeks. Level 500 is already compromised. And now 400 men are walking straight into it." Every light in the guard station died at once. Every monitor, every corridor strip visible through the doorway. All of it vanished, replaced by red emergency strips along the base of the walls. The atmospheric processors, the big industrial units that circulated breathable air through the facility, went silent. I hadn't realized how constant their drone was until it disappeared. The Atmos system, Boyd said. Somebody killed the atmospheric processors. The main system feeds air through every level. If spores or particulates got into the vents, circulation would spread them through the whole facility. He moved toward the monitors, then stopped when he remembered they were dead. Without it, we're running on whatever oxygen is sealed in each section. Local processors will keep a room alive for hours, maybe. They won't keep a deck alive. Who has the authority to shut down the main system? Coil, quarantine measure. You kill circulation to stop biological contamination from riding the vent network. And suffocate the witnesses. Boyd looked at me. He's trying to starve it, he said. Or everything else. I blocked the doorway. Is there a way off this asteroid? The expression that moved across his face was one I'd seen before, on the face of a dock foreman on Bridger, who'd realized the strike was about to turn violent and there was nothing left to negotiate. A man choosing between bad options in a window that was closing. The Warden has a private shuttle on the administrative level, top of the main gravity shaft, independent launch system. It doesn't need ground control clearance from the facility. He's had it docked since the day the organism was first catalogued. That was how long ago? He didn't answer. That's the last useful thing I'm giving you, Sloan. Get to the upper levels. Stay ahead of whatever's coming up from below, and keep quiet. If this thing spreads the way I think it does, noise is going to be the thing that kills you. He turned left toward the emergency stairwell. Something hit the stairwell door from the other side, a heavy impact that buckled the frame inward by 2 centimeters. Boyd stopped. The door buckled again. A sound came through it that I'd never heard a human throat produce. A rising, grinding vocalization that started as a scream and ended as something structural, like stressed metal bending past its tolerance. Boyd drew his sidearm. The stairwell door split along its weld line, and an arm came through. Fingers fused together, knuckles ridged with white plates, the forearm lengthened by new bone that tapered to a chipped, ragged edge. The arm swept sideways and caught Boyd across the chest. He hit the wall hard and went down. The thing behind the door tore the rest of the gap open and folded itself through. I ran. I made it 30 meters down the corridor before Perry came out of a service alcove and grabbed my sleeve. I heard the broadcast and I didn't go to staging, he said. His voice was controlled, but his grip on my arm was rigid. The air system is down. I can hear something in the lower stairwells. I pulled him along with me. The deep levels are compromised. Some kind of biological hazard. It changes people. The Warden's trying to contain it by cutting the atmosphere, but it's already spreading upward. Where are we going? Administrative level. The Warden has a shuttle. The main access to admin goes through the central corridor. That's 3 levels up and half a kilometer east. Then we use another route. The stairwells are blocked. I've been hearing sounds coming up through them for the past 10 minutes, bone hitting metal, a tapping sound like something hard on the pipes. The clicking. I'd heard it too, rapid, irregular percussion, like someone drumming calcified knuckles against a steel conduit. The sound of something that had stopped being fully human testing the surfaces around it. Perry closed his eyes for half a second. When he opened them, the fear was still there, but it had a shape. The maintenance corridors, he said. There's a service route through the east cell blocks that connects to the gravity shaft on the upper side. It's longer, but it bypasses the main stairwells entirely. I looked at him. 23 years old, 8 months in. Data theft conviction. He had been memorizing floor plans the way other inmates memorized commissary schedules, mapping the cage around him, turning fear into geometry. Take us there, I said. Perry's route threaded through maintenance passages and service crawlways I hadn't known existed. Narrow, unlit, rough-cut and unfinished. We moved by the helmet lamp I'd grabbed from the guard station, keeping our footsteps measured and our breathing controlled. The air was already thinner than it should have been. Each breath took slightly more effort than the last. A gradual tax my lungs noticed before my conscious mind caught up. The clicking followed us. always distant, always behind. Carried through the facility's steel infrastructure in a way that made direction impossible to judge. The emergency strips on the passage walls gave enough red light to navigate by, but the shadows they threw were dense and close. Twice I stopped because I thought I saw movement ahead, only to realize it was my own silhouette cast forward by Perry's lamp behind me. The maintenance route dumped us into cell block East 9, and the path forward ended. I understood why the moment my lamp hit the corridor. Perry, 2 steps behind me, made a sound that died before it became a word. The cell block was a double-loaded corridor, 2 rows of cells facing each other across a 3-meter passage, 60 cells per side, 3 tiers high with catwalks connecting the upper levels. Standard AUKUS construction. I'd walked corridors identical to this one 1,000 times in D-Block. This corridor was impassable. Every cell had become part of a single continuous structure. The inmates housed in East 9, long-term segregation, men serving life sentences, men who had been on AUKUS longer than anyone, had undergone the same transformation I'd seen in Vasquez, carried to its final stage. Their bone growth had erupted outward through skin and clothing, through cell bars, and kept growing. Spurs and plates from adjacent cells had met, interlocked and fused, bridging bars, cells, and corridor walls. The result filled the passage from floor to ceiling, a jagged white barricade of human bone woven through prison steel and concrete mounts, so dense that the red emergency light filtered through it only in thin, fractured lines. It looked like a forest, a white, dead forest, grown from human bodies and iron bars stretching the full 60-meter length of the block. They were alive. The men inside it, the men who were it, still breathed. Rib cages expanded and contracted between plates of armor. Jaws worked slowly against mandibles of new growth that had reshaped their skulls into blind, plated masks. Their eyelids were sealed under shelves of bone. Their hands, where I could distinguish them from the surrounding architecture, had fused to the bars they'd once gripped. The slow expansion of living lungs made the whole structure shift in tiny increments, a tidal movement rippling through 60 meters of interlocking bone. "We can't go through that," Perry whispered. "This is the only route to the shaft that bypasses the main stairwells." "Then we go back and find another way." The clicking behind us was closer. It had tracked us through the maintenance corridors, steady rather than fast, following the vibration of our footsteps through the rock. Going back meant walking into it. "We go through," I said. "Over it. The growth is dense enough to climb. We stay high, use the upper catwalk supports as anchors, and traverse above the worst of it. Every piece that snaps is going to carry. It only has to hold once." I went first. The bone was cold under my hands, dry and rough, with a crystalline grain that bit into my palms when I gripped. The first handhold held my weight. The second cracked slightly, but stayed intact. I found a rhythm, test with one hand, shift weight gradually, advance to the next anchor point. The growth was uneven, thick in some places, paper-thin in others, with hollow sections where the bone had grown fast and brittle around pockets of air. The trick was reading which parts would hold a man's weight and which would shatter under it. I climbed over men who were still breathing. Their chests rose and fell beneath me, pressing bone plates against my knees and shins as I passed. Warmth came through the cold surface in pulses, body heat trapped under the armor, still trying to be human. One of them turned his plated head as I moved above him, jaw working, blind face tracking the pressure of my weight through the fused architecture of his body. I held still until he settled. The catwalk on the second tier gave me a better line. The growth was thinner up high, where the upper cells had fewer occupants and less bone mass to contribute. I found a path along the rail and moved in a low crouch, placing my boots on tested sections of fused bone and steel, progressing meter by meter above the forest below. I signaled Perry to follow. He came up the same route I'd taken, lighter than me, more careful with his handholds. He was halfway across when his boot found a hollow section. The spur broke under his weight with a sharp, crystalline crack that travelled the length of the corridor. It bounced off every metal surface in the block and carried into the passages beyond. A single, clean report that sounded, in the dead quiet of the unpowered facility, like a rifle shot. We froze. Below us, the fused inmates twitched. A ripple of small movements ran through the bone architecture like a shudder, passing through a single, enormous body. Then, somewhere behind us, back through the maintenance corridor we'd entered from, the clicking accelerated. The slow tap of a patrol became rapid, convergent, and multiplied. More than one source, coming fast. "Move," I said. Perry moved. We scrambled across the remaining 30 meters of bone forest, trading caution for speed, and every footfall broke something. Spurs, thin plates, hollow ridges. Each crack fed the clicking behind us with a fresh signal. A section of growth beneath Perry's hand gave way and he caught himself on a cell bar, his forearm dragging across a jagged edge of bone. It opened his sleeve and the skin beneath it in a single long cut. He gasped, clamped his other hand over the wound, and kept climbing. The growth thinned at the junction where East 9 met the lateral access passage. I dropped from the catwalk to the floor, landed hard, and turned to pull Perry down after me. His forearm was bleeding through his fingers, the cut deep enough that the flesh beneath gaped open. Where it had scraped across the infected bone, white particulate clung to the raw tissue like bone meal ground into meat. The clicking was in the cell block behind us. Something large moved through the bone forest with a speed the fused inmates couldn't match, breaking their growth aside, snapping through the structure I'd just spent 10 minutes carefully navigating. The lateral passage had a pressure door, a standard emergency bulkhead with manual operation. I grabbed the wheel and cranked it. The door unsealed with a hiss of pressure differential as slightly better air rushed past us from the other side. I shoved Perry through, followed him, and hauled the door shut. The wheel locked. The magnetic seals engaged with a heavy, satisfying clunk. Something hit the other side hard enough to bow the steel inward. A second impact. Then the clicking came directly against the door, rapid and aggressive. Bone struck metal in a rhythm that was almost investigative, mapping the barrier, testing its edges, searching for a way through. It didn't find one. The clicking slowed, moved away. Perry slid down the wall to the floor, cradling his arm. The cut was ugly. 10 centimeters of open flesh, deep enough to show the white of fascia beneath, packed with bone dust from the surface he'd scraped against. His face was grey and damp with sweat. "Let me see it," I said. "It's just a cut. You dragged an open wound across infected bone. Let me see it." He let me look. The edges of the laceration were already inflamed, the skin around the wound hot under my fingers. That could have been normal. Any deep cut produces heat and swelling. But the bone dust in the wound bed wasn't sitting on the surface the way inert rubble would. The white particulate was already sinking into the exposed tissue, the granules settling into the raw flesh as if the wound were drawing them inward. Dose. Wound. Marrow. Whatever the organism was, it liked a door. I tore a strip from my undershirt and bound the cut tight. It was the only thing I could do. We had a sealed corridor segment on the east side of a dying facility, air thinning by the minute, and one path to the shuttle, up through a gravity shaft that connected every level of Orcus like a vertical highway for anything that could climb. "Can you make it up the shaft?" I asked. Perry looked at his bound arm, flexed his fingers, winced. "I can climb." I didn't tell him what I was thinking about the dust in his wound. There was nothing either of us could do about it in this corridor, and the information would only cost him focus he needed for what came next. The gravity shaft was 2 junctions ahead. The clicking had faded into the facility's background percussion. It could have been structural settling, cooling metal, the asteroid's own geology shifting in the cold. It could also have been a dozen blind, armoured things tapping their way through the dark, mapping their world one surface at a time. We moved. The gravity shaft opened at the end of the second junction, A vertical column cut through the asteroid's core, 50 meters across, lined with service platforms, cable runs, and ladder systems that connected every major level of the facility. The shaft was the spine of Orcus. Everything fed into it or branched from it. The generators lining the shaft walls were failing. The gravity field inside spiked and cut in irregular cycles, full pull one moment, weightlessness the next. And in one section, roughly 20 meters above our entry point, the polarity had inverted entirely, pulling toward the ceiling instead of the floor. Rubble drifted in the unstable zones. Loose tools, chunks of stone, a corrections officer's boot with the foot still in it. A dead inmate hung suspended in a null-gravity pocket near the midpoint, arms spread, rotating in a slow revolution that would continue forever unless something stopped it. Perry was worse. In the 15 minutes since we'd sealed the pressure door behind us, his wounded arm had changed. The swelling had spread past the bandage, the skin below his elbow rigid and hot, stretched taut over something growing beneath it. He held the arm against his chest and breathed through his teeth, each exhale controlled and audible in the quiet corridor. "Can you make the climb?" I asked. "Show me the ladder." I didn't push it. The shaft was the only vertical access that bypassed the block stairwells, and the shuttle was at the top. I was checking the ladder system for stability when I saw movement in the inverted zone above us. A figure crawled across the shaft ceiling, gripping the surface with bone-armored limbs, moving through the reversed gravity field. It wore the remains of a corrections uniform. The fabric split along every seam by plates that had erupted through its torso and limbs. Its face was destroyed. The skull had fractured outward from the inside, fungal bone fanning through the split skin in broad, ridged plates that turned the head into something like a grotesque crown. The orbital sockets were buried under an inch of new growth. The mouth hung open, jaw extended beyond its natural range by spurs that had grown through the mandible joints. It was listening. The ruined head turned in slow arcs, tracking sound, hunting by ear in a space where gravity itself ran wrong. A mutated guard, still patrolling its section of the facility, driven by whatever the fungus demanded of the body it had claimed. I pulled Perry back from the shaft entrance and pressed him flat against the wall. We watched the thing complete a circuit. Ceiling to wall, wall to cable run to an inverted service platform where it paused and swept its head through a full rotation. Every few seconds, it stopped and listened. It mapped the shaft with its ears the way a man maps a room with his eyes. Between us and the upper levels, every route passed through the guard's patrol zone. I studied the shaft. 20 meters below the inverted section, a maintenance alcove housed exposed mining machinery, drill arrays and a rock crusher, industrial equipment left from the original excavation, heavy iron, sharp edges deep enough to catch and hold anything that fell into it. The guard was making its circuit directly above the machinery. The gravity generator control panel for this section was mounted on the wall 3 meters to my left. If I killed the generator maintaining the inverted field, the ceiling would stop being a floor. I crossed to the panel, placed my hand on the power switch, and waited for the guard to reach the position directly above the machinery. It crawled into place, paused, turned its head towards something I couldn't identify. Maybe the vibration of my pulse carried through the rock. Maybe Perry's labored breathing reaching it through the shaft's acoustics. It started to move again. I killed the power. The gravity field collapsed. The guard dropped. A heavy, silent fall through 3 stories of open shaft, bone armor tumbling, limbs spread, the remains of its face turning downward. It hit the drill array with a sound that filled the shaft from bottom to top. Metal and bone, compressive and final. The body was impaled on a drill bit and folded around it, and the impact triggered the machinery's collision alert. An automated alarm, shrill and piercing, that tore through the shaft and every connected corridor. 6 seconds. The system's damaged wiring shorted and killed the alert after 6 seconds. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. because the silence was full of response. Clicking rose from below, from the lateral passages on 3 levels, from somewhere above us. The rapid convergent percussion of every mobile infected in range, locking onto the shaft and coming toward it. "Start climbing," I said. 50 meters to the upper access hatch. Perry climbed. I climbed behind him. Without the generators, our section of the shaft was zero gravity, which meant hauling ourselves along the ladder rungs hand over hand, boots drifting behind us, every grip and release costing time we were running out of. Below us, shapes entered the shaft from the lower access points. I looked down once. Once was enough. 3 armored figures, fast on the rungs, climbing with a speed their bone-weighted bodies shouldn't have allowed. Perry's pace failed at the 30-meter mark. His wounded arm was giving out. The swelling had reached his elbow, the skin shiny and drum-tight, and his grip on that side weakened with every rung. He missed a handhold and swung sideways, his body rotating in the weightless drift. I grabbed his collar and pulled him onto the nearest service platform. A small ledge bolted to the shaft wall, barely wide enough for 2 men pressed together. He couldn't continue. His arm, cradled against his ribs, had changed shape. The forearm was thicker than it should have been, the skin stretched over ridges pressing outward from beneath. I could feel them when I steadied him, small, hard lines under the surface, running parallel to the bone. "Perry." "I know." His voice was steady in a way that told me he'd been sitting with this longer than I'd realized. "I can feel it under the skin. It started in the wound and it's been working up past my elbow for the last 10 minutes. Something hard, growing along the bone." Below us, the clicking was in the shaft. Multiple sources climbing, following our vibrations through the ladder structure. "You need to go," Perry said. "The hatch is 20 meters above us. You can make that if you're not hauling me." "Perry." "Sloan, listen." He looked at me, and in the red emergency light his eyes were clear, stripped of everything except the arithmetic of what was happening to his body. "I've been doing the math since East 9. In an hour, maybe less, I'm going to be one of those things. I'd rather do something useful with the time I've got than spend it slowing you down on a ladder." I started to speak. He cut me off. "You've been telling me to stop following you around since my first week. So stop arguing and climb." I climbed. There was nothing in my hands, my knowledge, or my 3 years of prison survival that could change what was happening in Perry's arm. He was right, and we both knew it, and the only thing I could give him was the honesty of treating his choice as real. I was 10 meters above the platform when Perry started hitting the railing. A steady, heavy clanging, his good hand driving into the steel bar over and over, the sound ringing through the shaft, drawing every clicking thing in the column toward him and away from me. The infected below changed course. I heard the scrape of bone on ladder rungs accelerating upward, toward the platform, toward the sound. I reached the upper access hatch, hauled it open, pulled myself through, and sealed it behind me. The magnetic locks engaged. The clicking and clanging both went muffled, then silent as the hatch's insulation cut the shaft off from the corridor above. I sat on the floor of the upper level and breathed. A fine tremor ran through my hands, rapid and involuntary. I couldn't will it to stop and didn't try. The air was better here. Closer to the administrative deck's independent life support, the oxygen was concentrated enough that each breath filled my lungs instead of teasing them. I was running a fever, a low heat behind my eyes, in my joints, in the bones of my forearms where I'd spent 10 minutes gripping infected growth in East 9. Surface contact, dust in the skin, a small dose, spread thin. I left the thought alone. I couldn't afford it. The administrative deck was above me. Coyle's shuttle was on the administrative deck. Perry was below me doing the only thing he could still do, and I could not make that count for nothing. I stood up and moved. The route to the administrative deck's main entrance ran through the upper cell blocks. B-Wing, medium security, the section where inmates with clean disciplinary records earned marginally larger cells and an extra hour of lighting. The corridor was empty. Emergency strips cast their red wash across locked cell doors and bare concrete, and the clicking was present here too, distant, behind walls, above ceiling panels, the sound of the infection spreading through levels that should have been safe. I was 2 corridors from the admin access when I heard the hissing, a steady, pressurized sound behind a sealed compartment door on my right. I recognized it. A local atmospheric processor, one of the emergency backup units. Still running, still producing breathable air, and whoever was inside that compartment was breathing it. I tried the door, locked from the inside. I knocked twice, careful taps with my palm flat against the steel to minimize the sharp sound. The door cracked open. A face appeared in the gap. Male, mid-50s, hollow-cheeked. He studied me for 3 seconds, then opened the door just wide enough for my body and sealed it behind me. 7 inmates sat on the floor in a rough circle around the processor unit. A chest-high metal box bolted to the wall, its output vent hissing a thin stream of breathable air into the compartment. They sat still and silent, breathing shallowly, controlling every sound their bodies produced with a focus that carried the flavor of absolute terror held in check by absolute necessity. The man who'd let me in pressed a finger to his lips, then he pointed at the walls. Outside the compartment, circling the perimeter, I could hear them. At least 3, bone limbs clicking against the corridor walls. They suspected something was alive inside. They tapped their way around the sealed door, testing, mapping. The processor's hiss provided a blanket of white noise that masked the breathing within, but barely. 1 cough, 1 sharp intake, 1 word above a whisper. That was all it would take. The man communicated through gestures and mouthed words. His name was Holt. 11 years on AUKUS. He'd organized this group when the breach started and brought them here, to the processor, to the air. They'd been sitting in this room for hours, motionless and silent, while the world outside changed. He pointed at the far wall. Dill was the problem, sitting against the concrete with his knees drawn to his chest, shaking. He was a short timer, weeks remaining on a 3-year sentence before transfer back to a civilian facility. I could see it on him, the specific cruelty of being that close to release when release was being consumed by something growing through the walls around him. His breathing was too fast. Shallow, rapid gasps he was trying to muffle with both hands pressed over his mouth, and failing. Each exhale came louder than the last. The other inmates watched him the way men watch a cracked beam bearing weight. Holt looked at me. The expression on his face was a question he wasn't willing to mouth. Several of the other inmates wore the same expression. The calculus was simple and ugly. Dill was going to break, and when he broke, the sound would kill everyone in this room. I crossed to Dill. I crouched in front of him and pressed my hand firmly over his mouth. His eyes went wide, the whites showing all the way around, his chest heaving against my palm. I leaned in until my lips were beside his ear. "My name is Sloan," I whispered. "I've been moving through this facility for the last 2 hours. I found a route to the upper levels. There's a shuttle on the admin deck and I know how to reach it. I need you to slow your breathing and stay quiet for 3 more minutes." His eyes searched my face. His chest was still pumping too fast. "Breathe with me," I whispered. "In through the nose. Hold. Out slow." I counted for him, my lips barely moving, the words more breath than sound. I talked to him the way I'd talk to dock workers on Bridger who were afraid to cross the picket line. Calm, specific, giving him a task instead of asking him to manage an emotion. Telling him what we were going to do, where we were going, how we were going to get there. Giving him a structure he could hold. Dill's breathing slowed. My hand came away from his mouth. The trembling in his chest dropped from a visible shudder to a finer vibration. His eyes stayed locked on mine and his teeth were set together, every muscle in his face rigid with the effort of holding. But he was holding. The room held with him. 7 men and 1 thin stream of processed air, balanced on the edge of a sound that would end them all. Then Dill vomited, a sudden involuntary spasm. His body curled forward, and the wet, sharp sound of retching and liquid hitting concrete tore through the room. The clicking outside stopped. 1 second of perfect quiet. Then acceleration, fast, aggressive, converging on the compartment door from 3 directions at once. I was on my feet before I'd consciously chosen to stand. The voice that came out of me was one I hadn't used in 3 years. Built for a dock floor, for a crowd, for making men hear you above machinery and fear. Everybody up, far hatch, single file, keep moving and don't stop for anything behind you. The inmates broke for the rear of the compartment, where a secondary maintenance hatch led into the adjoining corridor. Holt was first through, wrenching the hatch open and hauling men after him. I grabbed Dill by the collar and pulled him upright. He wiped bile from his chin, eyes streaming, horrified by what his body had just done to everyone in the room. The compartment door buckled inward. The magnetic seal screamed and gave. A bone-plated arm forced through the gap, the blade edge of its forearm scoring a groove across the concrete wall as it swept the space. 4 of the 7 inmates made it through the hatch ahead of me. One of the remaining men, a tall man near the back of the group, was 3 steps from the opening when the door tore free and 2 infected poured through, fast and low, their armoured skulls turning as they tracked the scramble of boots across the floor. Another vanished behind them. I dragged Dill through the hatch and slammed it behind us. The seal engaged, followed by impacts that shook the frame and didn't stop. The survivors pressed forward through the maintenance corridor, gasping in air thinner than the processor-fed compartment. Holt, Dill, 3 others, 5. 2 men who had survived hours of silence in that room had died in the 30 seconds after it broke. Holt grabbed my arm. Admin access is 2 corridors north, but that route is crawling with them. I've been hearing the clicking from that direction for an hour. What other way? Down 1 level. The mining deck. There's an emergency access ladder at the north end that comes up inside the admin level. The mining deck has lost pressure. I could feel the cold bleeding through the conduit junctions on the way here. Then it's low pressure and bad air between here and the ladder. I looked at the 5 men in the corridor with me. Dill was still shaking. 2 of the others were injured, one limping, one cradling a hand that looked broken. They couldn't survive vacuum. Is there a sealed compartment on this level where you can hold? I asked Holt. Storage room around the next junction. Residual air, no processor, but the seals are intact. Get them there. Stay quiet. If I can reach the shuttle and launch, I'll transmit for help. Holt studied me for 2 seconds, then reached into his jumpsuit and produced a small cylinder, a personal emergency rebreather, the type AUKUS issued to corrections officers and exterior maintenance trustees. Good for roughly 10 minutes of breathing. Pulled it off a dead guard 4 hours ago. He put it in my hand. Dill looked at me as they went, still grey, still carrying the knowledge that his body had cost 2 men their lives. His mouth moved, forming something that might have been an apology or a question, but no sound came out. He turned and followed Holt. I dropped through the service hatch into the mining level, and the breathable air vanished. Sound thinned to almost nothing the instant the hatch sealed above me. The pressurized world of the upper levels disappeared, replaced by air so thin and cold it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. The mining level had bled most of its atmosphere through a structural breach in the asteroid's surface and through a jagged wound in the rock wall 100 meters to the east. I could see stars. Hard, steady points of light framed by torn stone. Between me and them, the cold of open space bled through the gap into the tunnel. The temperature hit my exposed skin immediately, a dry, searing cold that tightened the flesh of my face and hands. The rebreather hissed when I triggered it. 10 minutes. The canister's dial was analog, a simple needle ticking backward on a numbered face. I could feel the oxygen feeding into my nose and mouth, a thin, cool stream that separated my blood from suffocation. The level was occupied. Infected inmates patrolled the depressurized corridors the way their counterparts worked the upper levels, except here they could barely hear. Sound barely carried in air this thin. They had adapted. They dragged their bone-bladed limbs along the floor and walls, tapping against surfaces to feel for vibration transmitted through the physical structure of the mine. Through rock, through steel conduit, through ladder rails and floor plates. If my boots struck the ground too hard, the impact would travel through the substrate, and the nearest one would turn toward it. The same rule as the drill face. The asteroid won force. It rewarded reading. I moved the way you move in a mine when the ceiling is compromised. Slow, precise, each step placed with my weight settling gradually instead of striking. 600 meters of depressurized corridor lay between me and the emergency access ladder at the north end. I could see 3 infected in the first 100 meters, dark shapes against the red emergency strips, their bone armor catching the light in dull white ridges, their limbs tapping the walls in patterns that were almost methodical. Echolocation by contact, hunting for the vibration of something alive. I timed my steps to theirs. When they tapped, I placed a foot, using their own percussion to mask whatever tremor my boot transmitted through the floor. When they paused, I froze. The rebreather ticked. 9 minutes. 8. At the 200-meter mark, I crossed into the first oxygen pocket, a section of corridor where a sealed compartment on the adjacent level was leaking atmosphere through a cracked conduit joint. A thin zone of breathable air, maybe 5 meters across. I paused to let the rebreather rest and took 3 careful breaths of the leaked air. It was cold enough to burn my throat and thin enough to leave me lightheaded, but it was oxygen, and my body seized on it with a hunger I felt in my chest. The oxygen pockets carried sound. In the lowest pressure stretches, I was almost a ghost. In the thicker atmosphere of the pocket, my breathing became audible, a soft rasp, barely louder than the hiss of the leaking joint, but present, alive. 100 meters behind me, an infected paused mid-tap and turned its plated head in my direction. I held still. The infected listened. The leaked air carried the conduit's hiss and nothing else. After a span of silence that compressed and stretched at the same time, it turned back to its patrol. I crossed the remaining 400 meters in stages. Low-pressure silence, oxygen pocket, low-pressure silence. I timed each atmospheric zone to keep my breathing hidden. The rebreather carried me through the unbreathable stretches. The pockets gave me supplemental seconds of real air that extended the canister's life. The infected patrolled in patterns I learned and used, their circuits becoming the rhythm I moved through. Twice I stopped within arm's reach of a patrolling figure, close enough to see the individual plates of its skull armor, close enough to watch its blind face sweep past me while its limbs tapped the wall beside my hip. I held my breath. I pressed my back against the stone and let it pass. The emergency access ladder was where Holt had described. A vertical shaft, 2 meters wide, sealed at the top by a pressurized hatch that separated the vacuum mining level from the administrative deck above. I climbed the rungs without a sound, the rebreather down to its last 90 seconds, my hands numb from cold, the fever worse than it had been an hour ago. The bones in my forearms ached, a heat rooted in what I'd climbed through in East 9, seated deeper than exertion could reach. The hatch opened. Atmosphere hit me like a wall. Warm, pressurized air from the admin deck's independent life support flooding down through the gap. I pulled myself through, sealed the hatch, and lay on the floor breathing until the dark spots behind my eyes faded. The administrative deck was small, clean, intact. A short corridor with polished composite flooring and actual overhead lighting, powered by the deck's own generator. A separate system the Warden had installed for his personal use. The shuttle bay was at the far end, behind a reinforced door with a biometric lock. The door was sealed. I walked to it and knocked 3 times hard. "Coyle, open the door." Silence. Then a voice I recognized from radio transmissions and facility PA broadcasts. "Warden Coyle, Measured, administrative, thinned by intercom compression but still intact. Identify yourself. Ray Sloan, D Block, inmate number 77412. A pause. Sloan, the Bridger man. Behind his voice, I heard docking clamps cycling through pre-launch checks. How did you get up here? Through your facility, Warden. Through what's left of it. The shuttle is a single-occupant vehicle. There's no room for passengers. The Colonial Response Unit has been notified and will arrive within 72 hours. Find a sealed room with a functioning processor and wait for extraction. There are men dying on every level between here and the cell blocks. Your guards are gone, dead or turned. Your processors are failing. You killed the main atmosphere system and sealed yourself in here while 400 men choked and changed in the dark. Quarantine Protocol, Section 9. The manual didn't mention feeding inmates to whatever's growing in the deep levels. It didn't mention the exposure details. I saw the cavity at 612 meters. I saw Vasquez and his crew alive and growing into the rock. I saw your program. The pre-launch tone changed, faster now. A repeating pulse. Step away from the door, Coyle said. You moved the survey line. Silence. You opened that chamber from our side. You pushed the timetable when the breach got away from you. Then you sent every work-capable prisoner down there to collect whatever data you could before you burned the air out of the facility. The biological research program at AUKUS is authorized, Coyle said. His voice had not risen, but the words came tighter now, pressed through clenched control. Colonial Corrections Directive 1140, subsection D. I knew the phrase before he finished it. I had signed it 3 years ago with numb fingers and a guard standing close enough to make refusal theoretical. Supplementary biological sampling, I said. The clause is plain. You hid it in the intake forms. You authorized it at intake. Every inmate does. For blood draws, medical intake, vaccination compliance. For biological sampling, Coyle said. Consent is not invalidated because the subject declines to understand the document. The shuttle systems continued cycling behind him. He was stalling, letting the launch sequence finish while the door held. The organism was catalogued 9 years ago, he said. Cedaron has funded this facility's continued operation since that date. Mining output is secondary revenue. Prisoners as material. Political detainees are classified under a separate liability framework. Their authorization is irrevocable, even posthumously. I stood outside the door and listened to the machine count down behind him. You weren't sentenced to hard labor, Sloan, Coyle said. The labor was storage between sampling rotations. My entire imprisonment, my sentencing, the dock strike trial, the transport to AUKUS, was a procurement pipeline. 14 men died on a dock on Bridger, and the Colonial Authority looked at the survivor and saw raw material for a fungus study on an asteroid. Every political prisoner in the facility had been selected the same way. Inventory, labelled and warehoused in cells, scheduled for exposure. The pre-launch tone rose. Step away, Coyle said. I'm authorized to vent this corridor. The fire suppression cabinet was mounted on the wall 4 meters to my left. I opened it and pulled out the emergency axe, a short-handled tool with a composite blade designed to breach compartment doors during onboard fires. Sloan. I hit the biometric lock with the axe blade. The housing cracked. That door is reinforced. I hit it again. The lock shattered, and the magnetic seal lost its handshake with the door's control circuit. What remained was reinforced steel, and steel gives way to a man with a blade and enough swings. The corridor vent alarm started. Red lights strobed along the ceiling. A pressure warning scrolled across the panel beside the door. Coyle was venting the space. I swung again. Air began to pull past my shoulders, slow at first, then harder. The corridor tugged at my jumpsuit. The hatch behind me groaned as the system tried to equalize through sealed compartments not built for this kind of emergency. My lungs were still full from the admin deck's clean air. I held what I had and kept swinging. The lock housing tore free. The door released 2 centimeters. Pressure screamed through the gap. I hooked the axe blade into the seam and hauled. The door gave another centimeter. Then another. The emergency system fought me, magnets stuttering, steel whining against its track. I set my boots, pulled until the muscles in my shoulders tore hot, and the gap widened enough for my body. I went through sideways. The shuttle bay was small, a pressurized alcove carved into the asteroid's surface, open to space through a launch tunnel sealed by atmospheric retention fields. A compact single-seat craft sat in a docking cradle, its canopy raised, the warden halfway into the pilot seat. Coyle turned when the door buckled inward. The expression on his face was the first honest thing I'd seen from him. Fear, plain and formless, stripped bare of his administrative composure by the sight of an inmate with an axe standing in his doorway. He reached for the sidearm clipped beneath the console. He was not a physical man. It took very little. The shuttle was designed for one, but it would carry a body in the cargo space behind the seat. I left Coyle on the bay floor and climbed in alone. The launch system was simple. Coyle had built his escape to require ground control, authorization, and assistance from nobody. I cleared the docking clamps, fired the maneuvering thrusters, and the shuttle pulled free of the asteroid's cradle and dropped into open space. Through the rear viewport, AUKUS fell away. A dark, pitted rock bleeding red light from emergency strips visible through hull breaches, the structural damage written across its surface in fractures and vented atmosphere and silence. I found the communications array before I did anything else. I keyed it to open broadcast, every frequency the shuttle's transmitter could reach, civilian and military, encrypted and clear. And I talked. I identified myself, identified AUKUS, identified the organism and the exposure program and Directive 1140. I named every inmate I could remember from the shifts I'd worked, the cells I'd passed, the bone forest I'd climbed through. I named Vasquez. I named Perry. I named Boyd. I named Dill and Holt and the two men who didn't make it through the hatch. I broadcast everything I knew on every channel before the colonial authority could intercept and classify it. I talked the way I talked on the Bridger docks, loud, specific, directed at anyone who would listen. The transmission ran for 12 minutes before the shuttle's communication system was remotely disabled by a colonial signal override. I didn't know how far the broadcast had reached. I didn't know who had heard it. I pointed the shuttle toward the nearest shipping lane and let the autopilot set the course, and I sat in the pilot seat running a fever that was getting worse by the hour, the bones of my arms aching with a deep structural heat that had nothing to do with the axe swings or the climb or the cold. The Colonial Response Unit intercepted my shuttle 11 hours after launch. They kept me away from AUKUS. They transferred me to a Sideron medical isolation facility on a station whose name I was never told. A clean, white-walled installation staffed by men in sealed suits who spoke to me through intercom panels and drew blood through airlocked ports in my chamber wall. The fever was diagnosed as low-grade fungal colonization. The organism was in my bloodstream, in my bone marrow, in trace concentrations in my cerebrospinal fluid. The exposure in the deep cavity had started it. The sustained contact with infected bone in East 9 had fed it. The doctors told me the infection was stable, holding at its current integration level, maintaining a slow equilibrium that fell short of producing the bone growth I'd seen in Vasquez and Perry and the others. A chronic presence, a permanent tenant in the architecture of my skeleton. They told me treatment protocols were being developed. They gave me a room with a cot and a viewport and a door that locked from the outside. The intake paperwork included a line requiring me to authorize supplementary biological sampling as a condition of continued medical care. The language was identical to the AUKUS intake form. The same clause, word for word, that I'd signed 3 years ago when I still believed I was consenting to nothing worse than blood draws. Refusal would mean transfer to a general detention facility without access to antifungal treatment, a death sentence administered through bureaucratic withdrawal. I signed it. My open broadcast was received by 14 civilian relay stations before Colonial Communications flagged and scrubbed the signal. I never learned whether anyone downloaded the full transmission before it was pulled. 3 independent news services filed access requests for the source audio under Freedom of Information statutes. All 3 requests were denied on national security grounds. The official incident report for AUKUS classified the event as a catastrophic structural failure caused by deep mine seismic activity. All inmates were listed as presumed dead. The mining license stayed active. Cideron's quarterly earnings call mentioned the loss of the facility as a planned asset depreciation and projected replacement operations within 18 months. I sat in my room and felt the dull ache in my bones that the doctors said might never fully resolve, a warmth beneath the skin of my forearms and shins, deeper than muscle, seated in the marrow itself. I had escaped the mine. I had named the dead. I had signed the same form twice. The viewport showed stars I could catalogue by position and distance, the shipping lanes I'd worked as a dockhand on Bridger, visible as dim trails of running lights against the dark. The door locked from the outside. The blood draws came every 48 hours. Somewhere in my marrow, something ancient had taken root. It grew on a schedule older than prisons, older than contracts, calibrated to a timescale that would outlast the transmission, the names, and the man who had spoken them.